The 15-Point Plan is part of the Win Make Give podcast network.
Welcome to the 15-Point Plan podcast. Chad Hyams here without Jolene Snell. That's right, Jolene is not here with me today, so I went and found myself another powerhouse female person to join me on today's episode. We are going to be bringing to you Rachel Gregory. Now, I'm not going to read some bio. I'm not going to give you all this information up front. I'm just going to welcome her to the 15-Point Plan podcast, and I'm going to ask Rachel to introduce herself to each and every one of you. So Rachel Gregory, thank you for joining us on the 15-Point Plan.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Tell our audience a little bit about who you are, why you're here on the 15-Point Plan, and then we'll dive into some of the amazing information I know is trapped in that brain of yours.
Sure. So my name is Rachel Gregory. I am an online nutrition and fitness coach. I have a business called MetFlex Life, which came about as a goal to teach people more about what metabolic flexibility is. And I'm sure we'll dive into that in a little bit. But I kind of started my journey, grew up playing sports my whole life. I went to undergrad, got my undergrad in athletic training and sports medicine, went on to grad school and worked as an athletic trainer, realized it wasn't the career path I wanted to go down. And in grad school I actually got my master's in nutrition and exercise physiology. And I was really I loved everything about nutrition. I loved diving into everything, literally everything that had to do with nutrition. I did a master's thesis project, which was a 2-year project for my master's thesis. And I had to do a nutritional intervention in an exercise population. And I ended up looking at a ketogenic diet in non-elite CrossFit athletes. This was back in 2014 was when this started. So keto had just become popularized in people are just like, oh, keto is this thing. And they're, even myself going into literature, I had never heard of keto before. I knew about Atkins and things like that, but I dove deep into the literature with keto, kind of adopted that lifestyle for myself, ended up doing this study, graduated and started my own coaching business with a lot of people who were interested in keto. Realized for myself and for a lot of the people I was working with that keto is a great tool, but staying with keto forever for most people who are just looking for overall health and body composition improvements might not be the best goal to shoot for. So that's where the phrase metabolic flexibility kind of came into play in terms of kind of having the best of both worlds in terms of being able to utilize, ketones and fat for fuel when it's warranted, but then also not being afraid to bring carbs back in to help with performance. So,
Rachel, carbs are delicious. Carbs
they are.
Delicious. I've been doing a keto style nutrition plan recently, and my coach has just introduced carbs back into my nutrition plan. And I'm actually seeing, as I'm bringing the carbs back in, my weight start dropping.
Okay.
So,
yeah.
Carbs, delicious and apparently beneficial in my world as well. Let's take some of the stuff you've already talked about, some of the stuff I know about you, some of the research I've done on you, but let's start with just keto. So yes, nowadays it's a much more common term, like Atkins was in I almost want to say the 80s, but the 80s, the 90s, Atkins was one of the popular ones that everybody talked about. They might not have really known what it meant, but they just knew the term Atkins. Same thing with keto. People have heard the term. There's very few people who don't know what keto sounds like, as in the title of it, but they might not understand what a keto nutrition plan is. Can you dive into that and give us a surface level of the keto program?
Sure, absolutely. So keto just stands for ketosis, which is a natural metabolic state that occurs basically when there's not enough glucose or sugar in your bloodstream to use for energy. So your body kind of transitions to using more fat for fuel. So using fatty acids that can be turned into ketones. So keto itself, and this is something that a lot of people who aren't familiar with what it actually means or what ketosis actually is, they hear keto, they're like, oh, it's just kind of a fad diet or something like that. Like a lot of people tend to hear that, especially nowadays. But really, it is it is a form of a diet, but it is a metabolic state. So it's literally a natural metabolic state that your body goes into when you specifically reduce your carbohydrates and start to rely more on fat as a fuel source, right? So that's kind of the kind of general, definition of ketosis. And this was one thing also that a lot of people don't understand is that ketosis itself, yes, keto is a lower carb diet, but the goal is to get into a ketogenic state. And for everybody as an individual, depending on where you're coming from in terms of your metabolic health, your activity levels, your nutrition history, everybody can get into a state of ketosis in different ways. In terms of like some people might be able to get into ketosis on 100 grams of carbs. Some people, they have to go, down to 30 grams of carbs. And so there's a big variance, and it really is very individualized. So keto itself, just generally, it's a very low carb type diet. So you're basically reducing the carbs so that your body can rely more on fat as a fuel source and be able to use that fat and turn it into ketones, which can cross the blood-brain barrier and be used in your brain for energy and be used in your cells for energy.
Wow. Now, there's a definition for all of you out there going, okay, I never really knew what it meant. I just kept hearing the term and said, no way, it takes away my bread. You need to add fats, probably a lot of people, because they're going to be dropping carbs. They're going to need to supplement with additional fats. Give me some tips for someone who's going to go into a keto-style diet. Where would you recommend people start to get those fats before we dive into it and we stay on this topic of it? Where would you add fats into your diet, or where do you recommend to your clients that here's an easy way to add some fats that don't come with the carbs alongside?
Yeah, so that's all going to depend on, first of all, what the person's goal is going on a ketogenic diet, right? So what is your goal? Is your goal fat loss or weight loss? Is your goal overall just like mental health, mental clarity? Are you suffering from some type of disease state where you're looking to mitigate some of those things by, going into a state of ketosis? So we actually know that, keto actually came about to treat children with epilepsy because they needed to use ketones as an alternate fuel source. So that was where really the diet kind of evolved. And nowadays it's more so people hear of it as more of like a fat loss or weight loss diet, which it can be used as that, but it all depends on where you're coming from. So someone who, is coming from a place where maybe like in terms of their body composition, they're looking to lose body fat and they might be, very overweight, or they have, several pounds to lose. For that person, they could just probably start to reduce their carbohydrates and not even necessarily think about adding tons of fat back in, because with someone who's looking to lose body fat or lose weight, we know you have to be in a calorie deficit. So if we just transition from eating tons of carbs to eating tons of fats and you're not in a calorie deficit, then that in itself it's not going to be advantageous for your specific goal. So that's one thing to think about first is like, okay, what's my goal? Versus someone who maybe they, their goal is to just increase their mental focus, their mental clarity. Maybe they don't have like a ton of, weight to lose, that maybe that's not their goal. They're already maybe, on the leaner side. So they do need to, increase their fats to help to, if they're going to reduce their carbs, of course they need another fuel source coming in. So increasing their fat sources in that regard is going to help them, keep their calories in a good place, and then also help to drive more of that ketone production. So increasing, healthy fats, things like avocados, animal fats, healthy, oils, olive oils, coconut oil, butter, things like that. Those are going to be mainly like your fat sources that I would recommend. Nuts and seeds, those types of fats versus, we hear people have probably heard the term, or maybe for the term like dirty keto or lazy keto, where you're just reducing your carbs and you're only focusing on like foods that are low in carbs. So maybe you go to like McDonald's and get like a bunless burger and you eat that all day, or you are like putting a stick of butter in your coffee every morning and you're like, oh, well, there's no carbs here, but there's a lot of fat. That's where we need to kind of say, okay, take a step back and realize that, the food quality does still matter. It's not just, okay, reduce your carbs and bump your fats way up and you'll be good to go. There's a little bit more than that.
Okay. So Rachel, what I heard in that, and I'm so glad you answered the question the way you answered it. No, folks, I didn't set Rachel up and say, hey, answer it like this. She's bringing you her knowledge. Is just because we hear about Atkins, keto, Whole30, heck, whatever other program you want to name that's out there, unless we know what our goals are, we don't necessarily know that we're doing the program correctly. It's not going to necessarily just bring results, because maybe we need to just reduce. Maybe we need to reduce and supplement with something else. It's going to definitely be reaching out to somebody who understands this stuff to help people choose the program that's probably right for them, and then figure out how it works in their world.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Couldn't
Got
agree
it.
more.
All right. So you said, and I love when the guest says the same thing to me. Couldn't agree more. And I will say, make a note of this, Dave and audience and everybody. This is the first nutritional person we've had on any interview that I've ever that actually said McDonald's and didn't say turn around, right? So I'm not encouraging everyone goes there, but you can manage to eat there. Just get rid of everything except the burger. Go animal style, as I think In-N-Out refers to it. I don't go there either. Okay, so Rachel, you said a lot of this stuff, what you teach is metabolic flexibility, which is a really cool term. And of course, that's your website, MetFlexLife.com. So anybody wants to find you after or check out how they could work with you or learn more, it's MetFlexLife.com. But what is this term metabolic flexibility? And then what are some of those questions that, naturally comes along with it?
Sure. So in the simplest way, metabolic flexibility, and I refer to it as MetFlex, is just the ability to use the full spectrum of your metabolism. So what does that mean? What does having a flexible metabolism mean, right? So it's basically your body's ability to adapt and use whatever fuel is available to it and warranted at the time of either the activity that you're doing or the activity that you're not doing. So your body is able to efficiently shift back and forth between using its two primary fuel sources. And these two primary fuel sources are going to be fat, like we talked about, fat in the form of fatty acids and ketones, and then carbohydrates, in the form of glucose, sugar, that. Those are your two main fuel sources, right?
The delicious one, yes.
Yeah. So with being metabolically flexible, you're able to kind of use those fuel sources, like I said, when they're warranted. So for example, if you're—
So wait a minute. So you're talking about the hybrid car that's out there, that sometimes you're running it on gas and sometimes you're running it on electric. This is what you're talking about. And you're saying going back and forth between the two to get the most efficient plan and result.
Yes, that's a good way to look at it for sure.
Okay. So we are hybrid friendly on this call. All right, keep going.
Yeah. And then again, just to caveat, this is all also going to come down to the person's goals, right? And where they're coming from and all of that, their background, all of that is going to determine kind of where they're starting or where they're looking to go. And with that, that is where kind of becoming metabolically flexible can be very beneficial in terms of, for example, if you are someone who's pretty sedentary throughout the day, you're like sitting at your desk all day doing work, right? You don't want to necessarily be like, you don't want your body to be burning sugar for fuel, right? Because you're just sitting there, you're just, sedentary, you're not doing any, extreme physical activity. So you should really be able to rely on fat as your primary fuel source. You should be able to tap into potentially using ketones for fuel. And then when you're, out exercising or doing high intensity exercise or, any type of lifting or things like that, then obviously carbohydrates are going to be, the fuel source that you'll probably rely most on, depending on obviously what you're doing in that activity. But the goal is to be able to efficiently go back and forth between those and not always kind of— for example, a lot of people are sugar burners, I like to call them, where we are heavily dependent on carbohydrates as our main fuel source. We, especially in the standard American diet, and, people can't go a few hours without eating. They get hangry or they have like blood sugar dysregulation. So that would be more so metabolically inflexible on the side where you can't, use fat as fuel because your body's just not able to tap into that fuel source because it's not used to doing that. Versus, again, this comes back to where the person's coming from, the individual. There's people, and this was me, right, who have gone so far down the keto rabbit hole and they've basically trained their body to be so reliant on fat as fuel, and they've taken carbs out completely for a long, long period of time. And they actually tend to become metabolically inflexible on that side of the spectrum. And so when they start to, consume carbs, their body's like, what is this? I haven't seen this in a while. They're, digestive enzymes that are meant to be, around to help digest those carbs start to dwindle away a little bit. Not that they're gone forever. They're just kind of dormant, right? And so people have issues bringing carbs back in. So with metabolic flexibility, and this has just been from my experience over the years, from working with clients over the years, it's kind of just finding the best of both worlds and being able to utilize ketones and fats when when it's warranted, and then also being able to bring carbs back in. And one other thing I'll say with this is that a lot of people don't realize, but people used to be like our ancestors, and people even just 100 years ago used to be metabolically flexible by necessity, right? And if we
Sure.
think about it from more of that, ancestral or genetic perspective, we know that research estimates that there's about 96 to 99% of our genetics and our DNA hasn't changed in over 10,000 years, right? But our lifestyles have gone from, and they've transitioned from being hunter gatherers to now just like farming and factory and delivery dudes coming to your door. Like you don't even have to move to get your food. And that's just been in the last 100 years. So now we have food always available to us. So we don't like necessarily quote unquote need to be metabolically flexible, but that's what's in our DNA and that's what's in our genetics. So it's really just kind of bringing people back and realizing that like, that hasn't changed in a long time, but our environment has, and that's what's causing a lot of these metabolic diseases and diabetes and all of this stuff that's, piling up these days. So hopefully that was I know it's a long-winded definition, but hopefully that made sense.
You can tell we're talking to someone who went and got her master's in all of this, folks, because she's going to give you the information. Yet I'm going to just reiterate what I heard in there. Don't go to either extremes necessarily unless it's something that you need to for a health condition, because you want to be able to have the flexibility to be able to go back and forth because, well, carbs are delicious. And you don't want to end up in a position where your body can't even process them because you've given them up for so long.
Yeah. And I would say on one clarification there is that in terms of getting into a state of ketosis, you do want to go there for a little bit. But
Yep.
where people get into trouble is when they stay there for a long, long time. So like years, like on end, like several months on end, and they don't utilize carbs at all. And they it's really more so both from a physiological standpoint and a psychological standpoint that the issues start to arise.
Sure.
And this is where I came from with literally being afraid to eat like watermelon or any type of fruit. Like I was carb phobic, right? And so people get there, right? They get, we went through kind of the low fat craze, right? Where people were afraid to eat fat. Everything was low fat, low fat, low fat. And now, and the recent years, it's people are like now afraid to eat carbs. And so it's, again, we shouldn't be afraid of food, especially if it is real whole foods, right? We should be, aware of what they do for us and, how they fuel us and all of that. So.
Okay. Awesome. I'm loving this. Okay. This is great information for me, much less I get to share it with our audience today. So I'm really excited about it. Okay. There's another term that I've heard, nutritional periodization.
Yeah.
That's a tongue twister to have to say on the spot sometimes when you don't say it regularly. Talk about that. What is that? Because it sounds to me like a lot of long-term planning broken down into short-term goals, which, heck, that's what we should all be doing in our life, whether it's our relationships, whether it's our business, or in this case, our health and our nutrition. Can you talk a little bit to that?
Yeah, absolutely. So nutritional periodization, it is a tongue twister. Really, what it is just periodizing or planning your nutrition and also your training. You can kind of rank them into one if you're someone who is, focused on, certain goals, especially if they come to body composition. Obviously, you want to be focused on nutrition and training periodization. But with nutritional periodization, it's really just splitting a period of time up into phases or blocks, like I like to call them. And each phase is focused on kind of creating a specific adaptation or result. And, obviously they all kind of sink into the long-term goal. So with all of my clients, we look at the long-term, right? If I have a client who comes to me and they are like, okay, I want to lose X amount of weight or body fat within the next few months, I'm like, okay, if that's the goal. First of all, we need to see where you're coming from. And if you're ready to actually, go into a fat loss phase, or if you've been someone who's been restricting for a long time and maybe you need to actually come out of that restriction for a little while to kind of prime your body to go back into it later on. So that's part of it, like periodizing that. But then it's also just looking towards the long term. Like, what is your main goal, right? And how are we going to plan that out like a year from now and reverse engineer it so that we can do it in a way that we're focused more so on kind of that long-term goal and where you want to be versus kind of the instant gratification that a lot of people want to get from that fat loss goal, right? They want to lose
Sure.
fat right now.
I
So
want to
it's
lose 20 pounds in the next 3 days because it took me 4 years to add it on. So I think I should be able to lose it in 3 days, right? That kind of concept.
Yeah, exactly. And then it's also kind of looking at, if someone's main goal, especially like a female, for example, if your main goal is to lose body fat, but you also want to look toned, right? The word toned is something that everybody uses.
Yes.
Okay, what does that even mean, right? So what does getting toned
It
look
means
like?
your photo on your website. That's a woman that looks toned.
Appreciate that. And so this is, it took periodization to get there, right? It took education. It took being able to kind of take a step back. And I went through my own transformation, a while back when I was kind of doing all the quote unquote, I guess you say not wrong things, but things I just wasn't aware of. I was chronically restricting. I was chronically restricting carbohydrates, right? And so getting toned, especially for females, that comes from having muscle, right? If you don't have muscle and you lose body fat, even if you go on some crash diet or whatever, or even any diet, if you don't have any muscle tissue underneath that, like you're not going to look quote unquote toned or, have a lean physique. Like these are all the words that are kind of popping around the media and all of that.
Yep.
And so if you don't spend time fueling your body appropriately and enough to have enough fuel coming in where you can build some muscle, then you're not going to have the physique that you want. And that comes back to periodizing your nutrition. So going through phases where maybe we do go through a fat loss phase, but then we don't want to stay there forever. We want to, maybe go into a maintenance phase and really focus on actually maintaining the fat that you lost, right? Because you don't want to gain that back, right? You don't want to waste time doing that. And then maybe you need to go into a period where you're actually in a building phase, right? A muscle building phase. And females, a lot of us hear that and they're like, oh, that's just for males, like going into a bulk or a build. And that's not true. Like, if anything, there's a lot of females who actually do need to go into a muscle building phase so they can put on some muscle tissue and fuel themselves appropriately. And then when they want to go into a fat loss phase, they can drop some of that body fat and kind of unveil the muscle that they've built. But if you're chronically restricting, it's just going to turn into a whole host of issues and you're just going to continue to spin your wheels. So just
Rachel, hang on. I want you to say that again because I think, and not all of it, don't worry, because you're going to be like, what does he want me to say again? I want you to say that again, what you just said, because you work with a lot of women and I know a whole bunch of women from my gym life and other things like that. And heck, I know my own wife, even who we get into health at a high level and all that stuff. A lot of women always say, I don't want big muscles, right?
Mhm.
I don't want to look like such and such. Now, some women are like, yeah, bring it. I'm going to be big. No one's going to mess with me. And then some women are like, no, I don't want to look like that bodybuilder or whatever it's going to be. And you just said in there, though, that the women should consider building muscle so that when they want to tone, they can shed some of that fat and unveil that muscle that's beneath it. I thought that was such a powerful message. How do you talk? Let's just talk to the ladies in the audience right now. How do you talk to women when they say, I don't want muscles? I don't want big muscle. How would you encourage them and explain to them the necessity of it?
So the first thing I would say is that there is a big misunderstanding on what it takes to actually build muscle. And sometimes this can be like misconstrued in the media, or like if you go and see maybe a female bodybuilder or a female CrossFit athlete and you're like, oh, like they have a lot of muscle or they look big, right? That took years, like years, and eating, in a surplus and eating tons and tons of food and training maybe multiple times a day for years on end to actually even build a little bit of that muscle, right? So that's one of the biggest misconceptions. Like building muscle takes a long time and it takes being in either at maintenance or an energy surplus to be able to build a significant amount of muscle. And for most females, because we're so caught in this mentality of like, okay, we need to restrict because we need to lose weight or lose body fat to look lean, that most females are not anywhere near there, right? And also another thing that people don't realize too is like if you see someone who might look, a little bit bulky or bigger and they have maybe some muscles and they have kind of that, bulky, people say that, right?
Yep.
That bulk or that kind of big that you see is not from necessarily from the muscle, it's from the body fat that's covering the muscle. And so a lot of people can get confused about that. Like even if you see someone who has a lot of muscles, if they have, some extra body fat that's covering that muscles, it's going to make them look a little bit quote unquote bigger or bulkier. So it's not the muscle that's causing that big bulky look, it's the body fat covering that muscle. So when you lose that body fat, for most people, especially most females, you will unveil that toned, lean physique, right? And so this is just something that it's like a complete lie, really, when a female's like, I just don't want to get big and bulky. Like, I promise you, it's going to take probably 10 plus years of eating in a surplus or at maintenance and training, very, very often and following a very strategic plan to get there. So it's something that no female should fear that, especially if like you're coming from a place where you haven't been, following a progressive program and eating enough for a long period of time.
Guys, you shouldn't fear it either.
Yeah.
Yet I probably hear that fear from women more than I hear it from men.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
Men don't ever say, well, if my arms got too big, right? Nobody ever complains about that as a man. It's usually more of the women. Yeah, absolutely. Now you mentioned in there different kinds of training. You mentioned in there different things that are going on. Many people out there might know what HIIT is, right? High intensity interval training. And I'm going to ask you to kind of explain what HIIT is in a second. But then there's also LISS, right? The low intensity steady state. Will you explain the two of them and how our audience should be able to say, well, should I be doing HIIT training or should I be more in a LISS training position?
Mm-hmm.
How do you lead people to those, and tell us a little bit about each one?
Sure. So to start off, before I kind of dive into HIIT versus LISS and what they are, if your goal is to get toned, if your goal is to look lean, have a nice physique, then HIIT and LISS, those are types and forms of cardio mostly. That's how we refer to them, mostly cardio and conditioning. But if your goal is to get toned, right, and have a lean physique, you have to resistance train. You have to lift weights.
Wait, say that again. You have to do what?
Resistance train and lift weights.
All right, listen, everybody.
Yeah,
Okay.
and follow, not just that, but follow a program that allows you to progress and to, what we call progressive overload, which just means kind of doing a little bit more every time you go to lift your weights every single week. You should be working a little bit harder, or not necessarily working a little bit harder, but doing a little bit more. So getting an extra rep or adding a little bit of extra weight or executing the movement better. All of these are all forms of progressive overload. There's tons of forms of it, but it just basically means that you're, giving your body a reason to grow, right? Your body has to adapt. It will adapt to the stimulus you're giving it. So you have to do a little bit more in order for it to grow or to, build that muscle, right? And so that's going to come, the lean toned physique is going to come from the resistance training mostly. And then when we get into like cardio and conditioning, and we're talking about, within the different energy systems, I like to call them. So we have different energy systems. We have our aerobic system and our anaerobic system. Aerobic just means, you're using oxygen. It means with oxygen. And that would be more so like your steady state cardio, or your LISS, which is just low intensity steady state. So within your aerobic kind of energy system, that's going to be more of like the longer duration activities that are done at more of a sustainable pace. So typically anything longer than like 2 to 3 minutes is going to go more into that aerobic.
We're going for a run, doing a typical Peloton ride, not one of their HIIT rides, but doing a typical Peloton or cycle of any sport.
Exactly. Yeah,
That's
exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. So that's your aerobic, and that would be more so like LISS and steady state. And then we have our anaerobic system, which is there's actually two systems within the anaerobic system, which is getting a little bit sciencey, but just to break it down very easily, our anaerobic lactic system, that's one form, and then anaerobic alactic. So these are both without oxygen. And with the lactic system, or anaerobic lactic, which is, without oxygen and with lactate, that just means that you are, it's more so unsustainable bursts of activity that are generally lasting between like 30 to 40 seconds and can go up to maybe like 120 seconds, depending on the person's conditioning and all of that. That's going to be, and then if you go past that, it's going to be more so getting into your aerobic system. And that's going to be, doing, interval training styles of maybe moderate intensity training, or even, high intensity HIIT training, depending on how you're defining that, depending on how long you're going. And then the anaerobic alactic, which just means without, you're not using oxygen, but you're also not using lactic acid. And so that's going to be the system that's driving the first like 10 seconds of high intensity interval training. So if you're doing like 10-second all out sprints, that's going to be that system. So that's kind of just breaking them into the three. And the main thing to know is just that aerobic is more so low intensity, steady state, and anaerobic is going to be more of your high intensity, short bursts. Also within the anaerobic system, that's where you're going to have like your lifting. If you're doing, especially max effort lifts, like if you're doing like a 1 to 3 rep, max squat or something like that, and you're lifting, that's going to be more the anaerobic system. So with that being said, this going between these systems and programming them into your training so that you are actually doing some LISS and doing some HIIT, but being strategic about what you're doing primarily for what your main goal is, right? That's always going to be what we come back to. Like, what's the main goal? Where are you trying to get? Where are you coming from? But that's going to be one thing I'll say about this in terms of HIIT style training is that with a lot of females, and this was myself as well, we are doing a lot of HIIT style training. And that in itself can be an issue, especially if your goal is to change your body composition, right? Because HIIT is very, very demanding. It's a very, high stress to your body. So if you're doing HIIT training and like serious high intensity training, you're doing, F45 or Orange Theory like every single day, 5 or 6 days a week, and you're not eating enough food and you're not recovering and giving yourself enough recovery resources to actually fuel that activity, you're going to be in this cycle where you're just going to be stressing your body out so much that you're not going to get the results that you're looking for because you're just way too far in that stress state. And so for you, and this was me, sometimes cutting out HIIT completely for a period of time and really just focusing on lifting weights and doing some, low intensity conditioning or cardio, that can be kind of like the magic sauce, if you want to call it. I've never used that term before. I don't know why I used it now, but really that's where the results can come because you're giving your body a chance to say, okay, I'm not like super, super stressed out. Like I can recover now. I can actually build muscle because one other thing, and I'll stop rambling after I say this, but this is really important to understand that like when you're in the gym training, you're not building muscle. When you're in the gym lifting weights, you're breaking down your muscles. And if you don't allow your body to recover, then you won't build anything because when you're sleeping, when you're fueling appropriate, when you're implementing stress management techniques, that is when you're recovering. That's when you're building muscle. So that's something that took me a long time to realize that doing more is not always the best thing to do. And oftentimes for a lot of females who are struggling with this, usually doing less is what's going to get you the results.
Oh, I love that. Now, less doesn't mean zero. For those of you out there not doing anything now, saying, well, I can do less, right? It means overdoing. My wife was a prime candidate for that because she was wanting to lose. She would just run. She'd go 5-6 miles a day, 5-6 miles a day. Some days she'd feel really good and go 8 miles, but she wasn't getting to where she wanted to go because she was just always in that. She wasn't giving her body any rest. She wasn't giving the recovery, and she was stuck in a low intensity, steady state in that regard. And we both did Orange Theory for years where we were basically stuck in a high intensity interval training state for extended periods of time. Mm-hmm. Now I understand a little bit about what my coach is even doing. You see, I'm the kind of guy who says, I found the coach I want. I'm just going to shut up and do what my coach tells me. As you've taken me through this, I'm seeing him put me through, and I'm going to attempt the tongue twister, right? The nutritional periodization. My first 4 weeks that I've been working with Coach Jackson, who we had on a few episodes ago, he put us into a keto style diet program, and I've lost 12 pounds. And now I can see the future. He's laid it out for us. He's going to take us back up in calories and carbs, and then he's going to take us to a maintenance level, and then he's going to actually take us to a surplus level so that we're building the muscle the way that we want to, seeing exactly how it's happening, and giving us the weight lifting that needs to be done in there, not just saying, oh, good, we can just get on the Peloton or run every day. We are lifting 4 days a week with days of recovery in there for that purpose. So, folks, the key thing when it comes to all of this is get a proper coach. Find the coach that's right for you, like Rachel is talking here, and you can always go to her website, check her out. It is MetFlexLife.com. So you got the term MetFlex, just add your life at the end of it. MetFlexLife.com. You can see how toned she is in that photo, and you can also learn more about her. All right, so Rachel, before I let you out of here, I want to ask you one last question for everybody, male, female, that's out there listening. Okay. Clearly you have a lot of passion on the topic. Clearly you're going to give me like a 20-minute answer. And I'm going to say, no. This is the Jeopardy final round. So like the 1-minute answer sort of thing. I want first thing that comes to mind, top of mind from you. But I'm going to have you answer it after I remind everybody that they should be joining us in our Facebook group, which is facebook.com/groups/win-make-give, because 15-Point Plan is part of the Win-Make-Give network. We also hope you're sharing this episode with somebody. Not only are you going to MetFlexLife.com, maybe you're sharing this episode so they go to MetFlexLife.com and check out Rachel, because clearly she's got a lot more to share. Yeah, Rachel, as we wrap this one up, everybody, okay, that's not true. Most people want to lose fat. The only people who probably don't want to lose fat are the people who are already on the I'm extremely ripped side, right? So not everybody, but most people want to lose fat and have some fat they want to get off themselves. Give me some of the top tips. I want like short answers on this one. What are the top 2, maybe 3 tips you would give in quick sound bites to help people achieve this common goal of, I just want to lose some fat?
Okay. Top tips. All right. First one would be tracking what you're consuming consistently so that you know how much you're consuming so that you can adjust that, right? Because if you are just blindly, yes, you don't have to track to lose body fat, but what is the most efficient way to see what you're doing, what you're consuming, how much, energy you need to sustain where you're at. And then if you're looking to lose body fat, we need to be in a calorie deficit. So how do we adjust from there, right? If you have no idea where you're starting, then it's just going to delay the process and make things just a little bit harder and more complicated, really.
Good. So check. I got that one done.
Got that one.
Because
okay.
I'm MyFitnessPal, folks. There are other apps, whatever. Mm-hmm. I've been using MyFitnessPal for probably 2 years now. So I'm tracking. Okay, check. I got number 1 done. What's number 2?
Number 2 would be increasing your protein intake. So if you are not, that's another one that you can kind of go off of number 1. If you're not consuming a good amount of protein, a high amount of protein, and I always say for most people between like 0.8 to 1 gram per pound of body weight. If you have tons of weight to lose, you can go more towards that 0.8. If you're very lean, on the leaner side, and you're still looking to lose body weight, being more so on that 1 to 1.2 grams per pound can be a good tool. We have a lot of research coming out on protein, or has come out and continues to come out on the benefits of a higher protein approach for all body composition changes, right? So higher protein would be number
fish,
2.
Steak, pork, all those places where we're getting protein.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and good. I'm doing that. Check. Yep. What's number 3?
Number 3 would probably be, with fat loss as the main goal, just walking more and tracking your steps, because that is probably one of the most underrated fat loss tips I could give, is that if you're not paying attention to your overall movement throughout the day, you're doing yourself a big disservice. And this is outside of like any gym or, traditional cardio. This is just your steps, right? Because people don't realize that even just going on a few walks a day, that compounds itself over time, right? And like even just other things like standing instead of sitting throughout the day, like these are ways to kind of increase your energy outside of the equation and put yourself in a much better position to continue to lose body fat, especially if you come to a plateau. Paying attention to your steps is probably the biggest thing in your NEAT, non-exercise activity thermogenesis, is the biggest thing that people miss out on. And we know from the research that when people hit a plateau, a big percentage of that is because they've just stopped moving without even realizing it. Like you stop fidgeting, you stop doing things that you might have done when you had more energy coming in, because your body is just telling you like, hey, you're not giving me enough energy. So I'm just going to kind of put these other things on the back burner and not pay attention to them. And that in itself is just going to cause you to move less and all of that. So paying attention to your steps is an important tool within fat loss for sure.
Okay, now folks, I want you to hear clearly what Rachel said in that one. She didn't say anything about 10,000 steps, because we busted the 10,000 step myth on past episodes and how that was a marketing promotion for a pedometer company years and years and years ago. But tracking your steps, nothing wrong with saying, hey, look, today I got 5,000 steps. Tomorrow, can I get 5,500 steps? Or tomorrow, can I get 5,200 steps? Or heck, can I at least stay consistent? Can I get to 8, 10, 12, 15,000 steps a day, depending on who you are and what you're doing? She didn't say 10,000 steps. So don't be messaging me and saying, well, Rachel said, get my steps. Okay. Yes, she said, get your steps. She said, get moving. Movement matters in all of this, not 10,000 steps. She did not say that. Let's be really clear. All right, Rachel, on behalf of the 15-point plan audience, I want to remind them all that they can check you out at MetFlexLife.com. And you can check us out at 15pointplan.com, where you can get some resources that we have, such as the tracking tool for the 15-point plan. And you can find the links to all of our episodes. If you're looking for a specific episode, hit the website up. Rachel, we appreciate you taking the time with our audience today. We want to thank you for joining us. We look forward to listening to this episode a few times because I got to say, you talk fast, which I like because you're filled with passion and we might need to hear it 2 or 3 times to get all of the message. Folks, until our next episode, we hope this episode has upped your energy levels and improves your life.